Thank you for attending Strengthening Home Visiting and Early Childhood Program Implementation through Cultural Grounding and Responsiveness. Please note the following. This presentation has been pre-recorded. However, our speakers are present and will be available in our chat and to answer questions at the conclusion of the presentation. To submit a question, please use the Q&A button below. We will have live polling and the poll results will be shared at the conclusion of the session during live Q&A. We encourage you to use the chat window during the presentation, but as a reminder, comments deemed to violate the 0 to 3 anti-harassment policy, which can be found on the event FAQ, will not be tolerated, and anyone violating the policy will have the event privileges revoked. Enjoy the presentation.
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining Strengthening Home Visiting and Early Childhood Program Implementation through Cultural Grounding and Responsiveness presented by Programmatic Assistance for Tribal Home Visiting, or PATH. Next slide. My name is Tara Chico Hurio with PATH. Today, my co-presenters are Petra Smith, who is also with PATH, and Nicole Hunter with the Cook Inlet Tribal Council in Alaska. We warmly welcome you to this session and are very excited about spending some time with all of you today to talk about culturally grounded framework. As we move along in the presentation, please share any thoughts, suggestions, and ideas in the Q&A box. These suggestions and ideas will be valuable to this session. Today's session focuses on 3 objectives. This session identifies a culturally grounded framework and defines cultural responsiveness, helps gain insight through practical examples, and helps discover opportunities for strengthening cultural grounding and responsiveness. The 4 key concepts we will discuss include the importance of cultural context, cultural grounding, cultural responsive, and a culturally grounded framework. We will briefly discuss the 3 concepts and will spend most of our time discussing the framework. You will have an opportunity to exchange ideas about your programs or organization's culturally grounded framework. This session provides you with a general understanding of cultural grounding and responsiveness. During this session, we do not have sufficient time to go into detail about each of these concepts. Next. Our first key concept centers on the importance of cultural context. To understand the importance of cultural context, let's look at 2 definitions for culture. Culture are the life ways, customs, arts, social structures, and natural laws of a particular people. And according to the Webster's Dictionary, culture are the customary beliefs, social norms, and traits of racial, religious, social, and family groups. Culture can also include the greater community, knowledge, historical stories, food, symbols, language, skills and expertise, traditions, and rituals. This quote from a tribal home visiting program beautifully illustrates the positive benefits that result when we honor and integrate cultural traditions into programming. Talina Ives from the Port Gamble Saqalam tribe notes that the cultural adaptations help their clients and families to really feel part of the program. When we honor and integrate our traditions into our work, we find that there is more trust, more participation, and better outcomes. Another important reason for considering the importance of integrating cultural context into programming is that culture provides a sense of identity. Myron Lustig notes that cultural identities are central to a person's sense of self. Cultural identities are dynamic and multifaceted components of one's self-concept. In other words, culture provides a sense of identity for families and communities. We need to increase our awareness that the perceptions, actions, and interactions of children and families stem their meanings from the cultures in which they are embedded. By paying attention to and incorporating those unique cultural values, traditions, and related factors, programs can more effectively connect to the families and build relationships. Fitting families and children into universal curriculum options means risking the family not feeling a connection to the provider or the goals of the program. Using evidence-based curricula is very important. However, it is just as important to use adaptations and approaches that make sense in the culture you're delivering them in. One of the major advantages of local early childhood programs is that they know the communities they serve, so they can tailor their work to the service population and the community's culture. On the previous slide, we talked about how culture provides a sense of identity for children and family. When we see families through the cultural context, it provides an understanding of the factors such as learning, problem solving, parenting values, and social relationships and behaviors. It also provides insight about views on independence and interdependence, health and lifestyle choices, community engagement, political views, and ultimately their well-being. Understanding these concepts in early childhood for each family is a first step in relating to and thoroughly adapting home visiting curriculum in early childhood classroom environments. Our second key concept centers on cultural grounding. We view the concept of cultural grounding as organizationally focused. It goes beyond staff's individual competencies, and rather it is a holistic, value-based infusion of an organization's standards, policies, and practices. It is a continuous process of developing or transforming a program's or organization's rules, standards, and procedures that influence a set of human interactions. The goal is to closely connect to the lived experiences and core cultural constructs of a diverse, targeted population and community. This requires braiding the values, behaviors, norms, and views of the service population and community into program implementation. Each program and/or organization needs to decide what culturally grounded braiding means for the staff and the program, how it looks in the eyes of the family, and the impact it will have on the decision-making. Culturally grounded programs and/or organizations utilize collaborative approaches toward their development and evolve from the ground up. Odamoto and Collis stated the ground-up nature of these approaches indicate that they start from the values, behaviors, norms, and views of the population they serve, and therefore are most closely connected to the lived experiences and core cultural constructs of the diverse targeted populations and communities. The work often requires a community-driven process of redefining success and reframing how we understand problems and develop solutions. Our third key concept centers on cultural responsiveness. Through the empowerment of a culturally grounded organization, cultural responsiveness is the capacity of early childhood workers to continuously learn from and relate specifically and adaptive to the diverse service population. So, what does cultural responsiveness look like? Culturally responsive early childhood professionals take steps to actively learn each child's and family's cultural background with openness, curiosity, and respect. They apply this information to respond with flexibility and adaptability. They provide adaptive and equitable opportunities for children and families to participate and learn. For example, a home visitor may learn that seasonal fishing and smoking fish is an important part of an Alaska family's culture. In response to this, the home visitor adapts a curricular activity to include a homemade fishing pole and cardboard smokehouse.
Thank you, Tara, for briefly defining these initial concepts for us. It's helpful to have the shared foundational understanding of these terms and concepts before we now move into viewing an example of a culturally grounded framework. So you may remember from our earlier conversation with Tara that cultural grounding is focused on the climate and the support of an organization. So the climate, this climate directly influences the behaviors, attitudes, and beliefs of early childhood professionals. So in this respect, the desire is for our early childhood staff to behave really in culturally responsive ways. When an organization holistically implements a culturally grounded framework, then early childhood workers naturally have the necessary tools and resources and feel empowered and even required to respond to families in a way that honors and integrates their traditions and values. So these two concepts are really in direct relationship with each other. So now let's look at the details of such a framework. As you look closer at this model, you may note that it resembles an implementation framework. The key with this model really is to build upon your current early childhood's organizational climate and with a holistic value-based infusion of culturally grounded administrative standards, your policies and your practices. That are informed from the inside out and expressed from the outside in. So inside out and outside in means the organization learns with intention from the target population and community. So this learning is applied to help strengthen standards, policies, and practices. And then this framework in turn supports early childhood professionals who then can influence the families or the child's sense of safety and create a culturally relevant, supportive, and affirming environment. So you can see how the family and children and their cultural identity are at the center of this model. They are accepted, unconditionally accepted, and embraced by early childhood professionals. And then the early childhood professionals are holistically supported and encouraged by organizational standards and support systems. So the key here is to start with an organizational commitment to systematically work toward this or another culturally grounded framework. A second step can be assessing your current situation, and then you can follow that up with a third step in which you systematically address the gaps that you have discovered. We've included a simple reflection tool with your handouts that gives you a place to start if you wish to do that. The reflection tool can either be completed as a team or it can be completed individually and then aggregated. The framework's components are rated on a scale, and the tool provides space for documenting practice strengths and practice gaps. So we want to reiterate, or we want to stress that as you look at this model more closely, we believe that you will discover that you already have considerable strengths in these components. So moving forward can be as simple as adding one additional strategy, or it can be a formal community-involved strategic planning process. So let's look at some examples of how you can strengthen each component with activities that increase your organization's cultural grounding. So this component, leadership support, means committing to a systematic framework and taking action to create a culturally grounded organization. So some example strategies include completing a reflective process to assess the current situation, for example, using the reflection tool I just spoke about a couple of minutes ago. Another example could be allocating, or another strategy could be allocating sufficient financial resources and staffing capacity to fund framework strategies. A third strategy could be that leadership participates in professional development that includes critical self-reflection and then works toward advancing a culturally responsive leadership. And then a fourth example could include active and ongoing efforts by leadership to nurture positive relationships with cultural leaders from the community. This component, policies and standards, means providing obligatory direction for workers about practices and interactions that are inclusive of supporting the service population. So really laying out the practice standards and the activities for staff to follow. Some examples here or example strategies include hiring preferences for staff who are representative of the target population. So for example, making the first selection of interviewees from those who are representative of the service population, or perhaps assigning a higher point value when selecting interviewees. Another example strategy could be creating policies related to relevant professional development expectations that increase competencies and the knowledge about the service population. This component, a reflective learning process, means providing ongoing opportunities for deeper reflection and learning about the service population. So some example strategies include consistently including a reflection about the child's or the family's cultural context in reflective supervision. So that intentional effort to include that in the reflective process or in a case consultation process. A second strategy could be adding a discussion about the application of the framework as a standard action item on the weekly staff meeting agenda. And a third strategy could be creating a community of learning that meets to address or develop plans for strengthening the culturally grounded framework. This component addresses family and child resources and dissemination materials. The dissemination materials resources for the classroom and home visits and other materials should really be reflective of the service population. So some example strategies include working with applicable cultural artists, for example, to help design brochures and other dissemination materials. Another example could be utilizing an inclusive multicultural book selection checklist when making decisions about early language and literacy materials. There are a number of great resources and scholarly articles on the internet about this topic. And the fourth strategy could be providing children with opportunities to explore books in their own language. This component means the values, mission, and goals direct, inspire, and engage the staff team to braid the values, behaviors, and norms and views of the service population and community into the service delivery. Tara was talking about that earlier. Some example strategies here include creating written value statements that include explicit expectations about the building of fair and equitable relationships and fair and equitable opportunities and interactions. Another example can include the engagement of community members in families or service populations in setting the vision and direction of an annual strategic plan. A third example could be that an organization examines the vision and direction of the organization and how it's carried out and if it meets the service populations or the community's needs. This component, continuous training and development, means that organizations provide ongoing and robust opportunities to increase the understanding about the service population. So some examples here can include the implementation of a culture responsive relationship building competency standards. Another example could be the application of an annual cultural responsiveness self-assessment that helps early childhood professionals assess their own competency strengths and gaps. And a third example here could be that the third example of a strategy could be that you create a separate budget item for this type of professional development. This component means regularly including the diverse community voices representative of the target population to assist with the development of policies and practice standards. So some examples here include having relevant representation on the organizational board, for example, that is really truly reflective of all or most of the service population. Another example could be participation of service group members in focus groups or in an annual reflection process. Or a third example could be using or including cultural knowledge holders in classrooms or home visits to ensure culturally responsive learning and teaching. And this component means assessing the need for developing curricular adaptation or enhancement when necessary. Some first steps here in this process can include building some connections with peers or other programs who have integrated the organization or program into the cultural framework of a community. That with that connection, you can see if there are recommendations and approaches to consider. Many times, some of the work has already been done, and you can really build upon the work of others. Second strategy could be to work with the evidence-based curriculum developer to maybe receive some guidance on solutions that can be maybe more naturally adapted into the program. Many of the evidence-based models have completed research or have gained expertise on the adaptation of their models to various service populations. So some of that work may have already been done for you. So as you look at this overall model more closely, we believe that you will discover that you already have considerable strengths in some of these components, if not all of these components. So moving forward can be as simple as adding one additional strategy, or it can be a formal community-involved strategic planning process. And now I have the privilege to introduce Nicole Hunter. Nicole is the program manager of the Chonic and Home Visiting Program, which is implemented by the Cook Inlet Tribal Council in Alaska. Nicole will provide some examples of how her organization and program support family mentors in this work. Nicole, I think it might be helpful if our audience hear a little bit about your target population and that context about the indigenous people of Alaska. Do you mind sharing that?
Thank you, Petra. Sure, I would love to provide some context about that. Alaska Natives are indigenous peoples of Alaska, and they include the Inupiat, Yupik, Aleut, Eyak, Tlingit, Haida, Tsimshian, and a number of northern Alaskan cultures. They're often defined by their language groups and their unique cultural traditions. Many Alaska Natives are enrolled in federally recognized Alaska Native tribal entities, who in turn belong to 13 Alaska Native regional corporations who administer land and financial claims.
Thanks, Nicole, for providing that background. earlier, we talked about how a culturally grounded organization provides really that foundation for the cultural responsiveness of our early childhood staff. Can you please provide just a few of the many examples of your organization's culturally grounded practices that support your program and your staff?
Sure. Some of these are: our parent organization is committed to the Alaska Native cultural values and has provided an environment and workforce that reflects the various populations' cultural traditions, values, and beliefs. For example, in all of the buildings, we have traditional Alaska Native regalia, quotes, and artwork displayed throughout. Our organization also provides ongoing training and professional development opportunities so that our staff can increase their knowledge and awareness about the various regional tribal cultures. Our staff are representative of our target population and our program practices. They also practice Alaska Native preference in hiring. The board members of our parent organization are also representative of the Alaska Native tribal communities and corporations. The speaking of tribal languages and sharing traditions among staff and participants is encouraged and fostered in organization-wide cultural events. Our program vision also speaks to these efforts and is focused on supporting families in practicing their cultural identity. The vision of the Child and Home Visiting Program is to connect families, parents, and children to their full potential through healthy relationships that support positive growth, development, learning, and cultural identity.
Thanks, Nicole, for these great examples. I know there are many more strategies that your organization implements as well as your program. So I really appreciate that you also provided a more comprehensive list of these strategies as a handout for our audience today. Nicole, I'm curious about how the support of your parent organization has encouraged and empowered your program practices and the cultural responsiveness of your home visiting staff.
So our staff have diversified caseloads. So that includes people from their own tribes, but also from other tribes. And they take care to learn about each family's culture by using different tools to learn about their history. And then our staff use this information to create traditional activities and social events to reflect people's cultural religions and practices. These activities are also supported by the curriculum, which allows for cultural enhancements and individualization of activities. Some of these tools that we use are ecograms, culturograms, and getting to know you activities. We also use this information in our home visits to individualize services to respect each family's heritage. We encourage the speaking of traditional languages during home visits and group activities by including traditional books created for each specific Alaska Native language. Family mentors speak their home language with the families that share the same language, and they also actively work to learn the language of families who have different dialects.
Yeah, I love that you're including these tools like the ecogram and the culturograms, and also the getting to know you activities. What a really great strategy to get started with families and learn about families. So Nicole, as part of our handouts, you also provided a video that you developed for your program. This video demonstrates these and other wonderful examples. So we posted a link to the video in the chat box, and then you will also see the link again later in the PowerPoint. We do encourage you to look at that video because it really sort of exemplifies what the Child and Home Visiting Program has done to be culturally responsive. Nicole, we talked about why it's important to consider the cultural context of the families earlier in our presentation. Can you perhaps provide a couple of examples about how this has made a difference in the relationship with families and what outcomes your program has experienced as a result of applying this framework?
I would be happy to. Some of our families come to our city from rural villages and they don't have a support system in place, while others may be disconnected from their cultures for many various reasons. Honoring their cultures by respecting each family's cultural differences and getting to know them on a deeper level to understand the importance of their values and beliefs helps us to build trust and strengthen relationships. When families are able to build deeper trusting relationships with home visitors, it helps them stay more engaged with the curriculum and helps them participate in the program longer. We also support families in connecting to their own values and cultural traditions, but also provide opportunities to connect with other families and learn about other cultures and traditions. Emphasizing the importance of connecting to their own culture helps families experience belonging and a positive sense of self. Learning about and connecting to other Alaska Native cultures helps families build a network of support that they can rely on in times of need.
Thank you, Nicole, for this really valuable conversation. It's always great to have some really good examples of how programs have operationalized this framework. So I really appreciate my conversation with you. But I want to finish our conversation with a quote from one of your participants. I think that further demonstrates the outcome of including and cultural responsiveness in your program plan. So this is a quote from a program participant. She says, "My children are growing and learning from the Chanakan program. They have come such a long way. They listen to me more. They get to learn how to live off the land, to gather and pick food and other things that are culturally based. You get to meet with people of different cultures and learn from them." So thank you for providing that quote for us, Nicole. I think that brings a really great closure to our conversation.